Donald Trump also feels that the US has been taken advantage of. And, there are some key industries, cars, pharmaceuticals, that are in the crosshairs of his tariff policy, which will cause a real headache for the UK because they're among some of the UK's biggest manufacturing exports to the US.
Trade is an issue where Trump is his own person, and it doesn't really matter who's around him. He's had fixed views and very strong views on trade for 40 years. Wrote a book about it. He hasn't changed much. It's a victim narrative. The United States is a victim of the foreigners that are stealing our jobs, undermining our economy, and compromising our security. And that hasn't changed.
Rachel Reeves has arrived in Washington at the IMF summit to discuss the precarious global situation set off by Donald Trump's tariffs. Let's speak to Alistair Dorber, the Washington correspondent for The Times and Sunday Times. Will she be getting there with a hope, Alistair, of achieving real concrete change?
Morning, Danny. I think that's what her objective is, right? I mean, she's coming. She arrives today. I think she's here already. And her aim, perhaps not to be completed on this trip necessarily, but is at some point down the track to get a trade deal for the UK, which hopefully will smooth out some of these bumps caused by tariffs placed on UK exporters when they want to send their products to the US. But also, I mean, the other thing as well is in perhaps in the shorter term, and there's obviously a causal link between the two, but the markets. I mean, in the last month alone. We've got the Wall Street Journal talking about comparisons with the Great Depression. We've got the dollar down 10% since Donald Trump came into office, which of course won't help UK exporters. So I think there'll be an effort by Rachel Reeves this week and other finance ministers to try and calm markets, to try and assuage some of the fears that are out there. But also in the longer term, from her point of view, it's to set in track this idea of a trade deal with the US.
So we know what the take is. We want this reduction in tariffs, and we want certainly not to be exempted from any kind of extra tariffs, but we'd like to go even below the 10%, which seems to be a minimum for Trump. So we know what the take is. What's the give? What is Rachel Reeves offering?
Well, there is good news for the Brits, I think, here. There was an interview with JD Vance, the vice president in the UK, not too long ago, where he was hopeful of a great trade deal. I mean, he did define what a great trade deal was and who it might be great for. But that's positive. That's positive mood music. The other thing is that Donald Trump likes the UK. He's got links to the UK. He owns golf courses in Scotland. His mother was from Scotland. He's extremely excited about the state visit later this year. And that might sound a little bit silly, but this soft power really is something that I think Rachel Reeves and other British ministers, when they come to Washington, can really exploit. That said, Donald Trump also feels that the US has been taken advantage of. And, there are some key industries, cars, pharmaceuticals, that are in the crosshairs of his tariff policy, which will cause a real headache for the UK because they're among some of the UK's biggest manufacturing exports to the US.
Are any of the food and agricultural goods that were so controversial in the general election in 2017, are any of those, things like chlorinated chicken, or to use a terrible phrase, on the table?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's incredible how these things come back around. Rachel Reeves has a meeting with Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, on Friday, where I think some of the details will be thrashed out. But yeah, I mean, I think all these things are back in play. I mean, we thought we'd perhaps seen the end of chlorinated chicken. I don't think we have. I think that's something that the US is very keen to start exporting to the UK. And of course, like every other country on the planet, the UK feels itself in a bit of a stranglehold at the moment, and it knows it's going to have to make concessions. I mean, we had the growth forecast being slashed with the borrowing figures up. The picture isn't so rosy for Rachel Reeves at the moment, so she's going to have to give something.
One last thing. This is obviously a story here. We're leading with it on this programme. Is any American media outlet paying the slightest bit of attention to Rachel Reeves?
I mean, I'd love to be. I'd love to say that Rachel Reeves' visit here is front page of all the major newspapers. I'm afraid it's not. I think the concentration much more is on whether the tariff policy, in a general sense, is the right one. Will the markets bounce back? Will there be a recession avoided towards the end of the year? Of course, the UK is a very important trading partner. Of course, Washington takes what the UK says very seriously, and she will get a very good reception. You know, she'll meet the top people. She'll be treated very well. But it's just not something that's really top of the agenda here this week.
Oh, well, good. You and I, Alistair, Alistair is our Washington correspondent for Times and Sunday Times. We can corner the market in that precious Rachel Reeves news. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. And someone who will be involved in some discussions of talks at the summit will be US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. Is he the good guy in all this? Because some people say he's pushing Trump towards more sensible economic policy. My next guest certainly thinks so. William Alan Reinsch, who was the former head of the National Foreign Trade Council turned economics expert at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, also Undersecretary of Commerce for Export Administration during the Clinton administration, is with me to discuss this. Welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be with you. Happy to hear that chickens are back on the table.
Exactly. They're coming home to roost. Do you think that Bessent is actually playing a good cop then?
Oh, yes. I think that's his role. That's generally the role the Treasury Secretaries play. And his job is to worry about the markets. And as you've just been discussing, the markets are in disarray. There's a classic yo-yo effect. They're way up, they're way down. Every time Trump opens his mouth, something happens. And Bessent's job really is to calm troubled waters. And he, at least this week, seems to have persuaded the president to take a softer line. But as you know, from the last 2 months, this goes up and down. So we'll see how long that lasts.
Well, it was a long debate in the last administration of Donald Trump as to whether some people in it were enabling him. They were enablers of, you know, a fairly erratic strategy, or were they controlling him and actually managing to at least get some sense in what would otherwise be a very erratic policy. So when you take someone like Peter Navarro, who has been involved in trade talks, was also involved in COVID protection debates, then you had more establishment people countering them. Is your view that those people are valuable, they should be in the administration, you're encouraging them to do that, or are they enablers of Trump? If they weren't there, Trump would be able to get away with less rather than more?
Well, I think trade is an issue where Trump is his own person, and it doesn't really matter who's around him. He's had fixed views and very strong views on trade for 40 years. Wrote a book about it. He hasn't changed much. It's a victim narrative. The United States is a victim of the foreigners that are stealing our jobs, undermining our economy, and compromising our security. And that hasn't changed. One of the questions that keeps coming up here from foreign delegations that visit is, who can we talk to? You know, who can really speak for the president? And the answer is clear: nobody. Nobody speaks for the president. Trump, at various points, has contradicted Navarro, Bessent, and Lutnick on specific things that they've said. And I think the foreign delegations are learning that if you want to have a successful negotiation, you really have to talk to the president directly.
What about Bessent privately telling, as has been reported, JP Morgan bankers yesterday, that Trump's 145% tariffs on China are unsustainable? I mean, I presume you think he's right. Do you think it's significant that he's acknowledging it, and do you think that that goes beyond him?
Well, he's right. He said the same thing publicly, that he expected yesterday, that he expected the tariffs to come down. I think they will. We're all watching the China situation very carefully because it's different from other countries. It's a very big relationship. Frankly, I think that Trump and Xi Jinping are a lot alike in many ways. Trump appears to want to make a deal. He attempted to do that in his first term. It turned out to be not very much of a deal, but there was one. Looks like he'll try again. The Chinese will certainly insist that the tariffs, they'll insist the tariffs come off. They'll probably end up with them coming down. Personally, I think it will end up being another small deal and not a big one. But right now, think of it as a sumo match. You've got these two 400-pound guys foot stomping, grimacing, throwing rice around, and they'll do a belly bump, but eventually they'll get to the table and talk.
What about the Chancellor's visit? She's going to meet Scott Bessent later this week, and we've obviously been discussing how important that visit is for UK growth figures and the economy. Do you expect it to be successful?
Well, I think that depends on how you define success. Alistair said it very well that I think Trump likes the UK. He likes the current prime minister, at least this week. And so I think it will be a happy meeting, and both sides will announce they've made progress. It appears from, early signs of these talks that they tend to be, at this stage, generalities and lead, if anything, to sort of framework agreements, general principles, and agreement to talk details later on. And I expect on Friday that's the kind of meeting the Chancellor will have, one that where both sides announce progress made, good progress made, and path towards some kind of a memorandum of understanding is moving forward. I would be surprised if they get into the weeds of trade negotiations. In other words, I don't think they're going to talk about chickens on Friday. They're going to talk about big picture.
Can I talk about your side of the sort of political argument? Bill Clinton came in having the Democrats having, I suppose, rejected the Dick Gephardt alternative of going down the tariff and protection route. He introduces NAFTA. He pulls the Democratic Party away from that kind of tariff solution. And now they're faced with this big political challenge. Do you think they're going to go back towards that?
Well, they already were. If you look at the Biden administration, he kept a lot of Trump's China tariffs and steel and aluminum tariffs to a certain extent in place. And he created a different narrative about trade, which was that globalization, including then what was it, Clinton's accomplishment of NAFTA, was good for corporate executives and big companies, but not so good for workers. In a way, there are similarities between the Trump narrative and the Biden narrative, and this is one of these. What happens a lot in trade policy is the left and the right gang up and shoot the center, and that's what's happening here. On the left, you see in our progressive movement, you see concerns about workers not being treated fairly, concerns about wages, and on the far right, you see concerns about the United States not being treated fairly by the foreigners. And together they get together on a trade policy that is much more protectionist than Clinton or Bush or Obama, for that matter.
Well, William Alan Reinsch, former Undersecretary of Commerce during Bill Clinton's presidency, thank you very much for joining me.